Hello, everyone. It's working, I take it. So it's my task and my pleasure to welcome all of you to Fordham. I want to say Fordham Law School, although technically we're not in Fordham Law School at the moment. This is kind of a throwback for me. I started my career here so long ago and did many events in McNally, but this is the first time I've been back here for a while. So it's good to see everyone tonight. I'm here in person and those of you who are online. My name is Tracy Higgins. I'm a law professor here and I teach U.S. constitutional law and international human rights. And I'm the faculty director of the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice, where for a little bit shockingly to me, for more than 2 decades, we have been teaching students about international human rights law, doing scholarship in that field, and training those students to be advocates. And it's my pleasure tonight to be here with my colleague, Bennett Capers, who is head of the Race Law and Justice Center here at Fordham. And we're collaborating on this event tonight and also have started a new clinic, the Global Anti-Racism Clinic here at Fordham, which is the first of its kind. We're super excited about it. We have 12 students, I think, enrolled this semester. And our goal is to help students understand and utilize the kinds of institutions that we are going to learn about here tonight. So I want to pass the tiny microphone.
So I have the sort of less interesting sort of thing to say. I'm going straight into housekeeping. So for those of you, yes, you can hold this. So I'm really speaking for those of you who are interested in getting CLE credit. So in order to receive CLE credit, the affidavit and evaluation forms must be filled out within 30 days of the event. Upon completion, the forms will automatically be emailed to the team. I'm reading because this has to be like very the CLE code. Everybody, again, that is CU. The CLE affidavit and evaluation forms can be out at the end of the program. For any CLE related questions, contact the Fordham Law Events team at lawcle@fordham.edu. Someone from the team will be monitoring that email account and will be in touch with you. So that's the last thing on the script. The only other thing I'll say is obviously this, I said it's very happy to be co-sponsoring the rest of the program.
1 minute and we're off stage now.
My name is Kay McDougall, and for the last 8 to 9 years, I have been a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I am also here, next door is law school actually, as a distinguished scholar in residence at the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice and the Fordham Center on Race, Law, and Justice. These people who just opened our program are the directors. So I want to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for joining us this evening as we meet on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Nation. In gathering here to discuss issues of decolonization and liberation, we have to keep in our minds the fact that anything we do in that regard has to be intricately tied to the liberation of all people who've been dispossessed and oppressed. Again, thank you for joining us here. As many of you know, the UN started out of a desire and a commitment to end racial discrimination. That has been a pledge made in every single human rights treaty of the United Nations. But at times, the urgency of that imperative has not been consistently reflected in the work of the United Nations. But the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, the 20th anniversary of the seminal World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, and the global outrage about the murder of George Floyd by police. All this created a momentum that propelled the UN to renew and refresh its commitment toward racial justice. And to do so by creating 2 new institutional mechanisms and have them sort of be such that they resonate in the contemporary voices and approaches of this day, not of the day in 1947 when the UN was first born. So all these dynamics make this a very opportune time for us to gather and to reflect on this new UN architecture of institutional mechanisms against racism. And to do so, we have this evening, and I'm thrilled to say, we have gathered representatives from each of the following UN mechanisms to discuss their successes and their challenges. And I will tell you that, as we said in the green room, we were all thrilled because this is the first time we have ever had the opportunity to get together as a body, not as separate wings, silos, to talk about the kinds of things we're going to talk about with you. So, you know, this is a kind of a historic moment, and I'm glad to share that with you and with the over 600 people that registered for this event. Most, of course, online, but many here in person. So I am happy to welcome Tendaye Akiome, the Special Rapporteur Against Racism, Maureen Shepard, who is chair of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Dominique Day, expert member of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, Justice Yvonne Makoro, chair of the Expert Mechanism on Racial Justice and Equality in Law Enforcement, which I always refer to as the George Floyd mechanism. Gaynell Curry and Justin Hansford, both members of the brand new, well, almost new, Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And I ask you to please join me on stage. We are getting settled on stage. I want to invite the audience, both in this room and online, to notice that we have in the program giving you all of the wonderful things about the bios of these individuals, and we have given you descriptions of the mechanisms that they sit on. So I'm not going to repeat all of that as we go forward. I do want to welcome as well, in our audience, we have Ms. Catherine Namakula, who is now the chairperson of the Working Group on People of African Descent. Thank you very much for being with us. So everybody go. Now, as we get started, I want to remind the panelists, as I said in the green room, but you did hear, that this is not an evening for speeches. Rather, we want to talk candidly to each other about the successes and the challenges that we've been facing in the work that we're trying to do. I want to first turn to Yvonne Makoro, who is joining us on the screen from Sweden, where she and her mechanism, the George Floyd mechanism, is conducting its first official mission. So Yvonne, and please let me call you all by your first name, so opposed to the stilted UN way of Mr. and Mrs. whatever. Yvonne, the independent expert independent expert mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement is one of the newest institutional mechanisms in the UN dealing with racism. And it's one that has really come into being from or in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And participating in its birth, if you will, civil society made a big point of insisting that it speaks to the organic connection between the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism and the impunity of police murders that are driven by the same sort of racist attitudes of those systems of oppression. So the first question I have for you is, how are you going to approach these issues in a way that is effective, but without defaulting to a more narrow discussion about police state violence in individual cases? You have, I think you muted.
Very important question, Gay. But look, it is important that we do respond to those individual incidents of police violence and racism, racial discrimination, and because these cause immense collective trauma, no doubt about it. And it also causes untold individual pain, personal pain, where it happens. And that is why it is also part of our mandate to respond to those individual incidents. So we make no mistake that we also have to respond to those and address those. However, as the question is posed, if we focus only on those narrower issues, we might miss the boat and lose the plot. Because racism in the systems of jurisdictions which we have to deal with as legacies of colonialism, of systems which are lingering as a result of, for example, the transatlantic slave trade. Many of those systems remain. And unless we address those systems and work to eliminate racism and race discrimination as remnants of the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism. If you take, for example, apartheid in South Africa, it was important to deal with the systems and deal effectively with systemic racism. The laws must be investigated. The policies, attitudes, police attitudes, for example, and all of those practices which enable the police to escape accountability and continue to conduct themselves in a way that causes all the suffering with impunity. But then it is not easy. It's not always easy for jurisdictions to acknowledge the racism, particularly now that it is argued we no longer have the slave trade. We no longer have, if you take South Africa, apartheid. We no longer have colonialism. If we believe that, and we act as if, because the systems are gone, the laws are gone, the policies are gone, and the practices no longer have authority in the laws, we will find ourselves in a situation where the practices, the attitudes, which, as I say, are lingering, cause immense racial pain, discrimination, and it goes undetected. But then how do you get jurisdictions to acknowledge that racism still exists in their systems? You have to insist on responses which record the data, which records the conduct of police in terms of data, which is disaggregated in terms of race, ethnicity, etc. Because unless you do that, the systems might make racism invisible, but the numbers will show it.
Yeah, so if I can interrupt you, I note that your first report, your first annual report was on data, essential nature of having to have the data and disaggregate it, et cetera. But let me ask you a question that I've been asked several times. Why, if that's the framework you're using, why is your first mission to Sweden? I'm not saying that Sweden doesn't have its problems, but I'm not, what I mean? I'm not sure I would have chosen Sweden as the first place. Why have you chosen Sweden?
An important approach that we take to the work that we do is to stay in touch with those who work on the ground, those who work on the ground with impacted people themselves, their families, and the communities in which they live, and civil society on the ground. And you will be surprised about the reports that we get from civil society on the ground, people who are impacted on the ground about the conduct of police generally and incidents of police racism and racial discrimination in particular. So we respond to information from our stakeholders, and our stakeholders includes those civil society, impacted people, their families, and their legal assistants or lawyers, and the communities in which they live, those who are impacted by police conduct. And we also, of course, as you know, we have to wait until we get invited by these countries. And we are fortunate that Sweden has invited us to come in and look at their systems and the conduct of police. And we are doing exactly that. As you said.
Okay. This raises another problem that we all have, which is that in order to do a mission in a country, the country has to agree. And I'm going to tell you, when I was a special rapporteur, not a single country agreed to me when there were the real problems going on at the time. So it's, the ones that agree tend to be the ones that feel that they have something to show off. Let me switch now to Green Shepherd, who is the chair of the treaty body that oversees the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, one of the first human rights treaties which was adopted in 1968. And by the way, since then, she is the first woman from the African diaspora to chair the Committee Against Racial Discrimination. Really, give the three successes. It doesn't have to be just in your tenure, but of serve. Three success stories, and then tell us a little about the greatest challenges you face and be great.
I will try, but I have to begin by thanking you for inviting me and to greet my fellow panelists and to the audience online. This is a forum that I've been hearing about every single day since I've became a Cuba.
Excuse me, can you turn up the microphone, please? Turn it.
Oh, she told me not to touch it.
Yeah, yeah.
When Gay gives that instruction, I try to behave. But, don't scold me, Gay, because I have to tell you that when I was chairman working with kids for some people back in the said, one of our missions was to Sweden, because that's where people invited us. And you're correct about how the system works. Who invites us? We have to make a certain number of country visits per year. We go. But actually, Sweden does have its issues in terms of people of African descent. Having said that, and following you again, Gay, I am kind of sad today because Jamaica is mourning, or we continue to mourn, as Yvonne talked about police violence and atrocities, because we're still in that period of mourning for the over 500 people who were shot or hanged by the British colonial forces because our people bawled out for justice in the Morant Day War of 1865. So I have to honor them because the hangings did not stop until November 13th. We're still in that moment. Now, I will talk about three of the issues that in my mind are critical to how CERT functions. And my three Gay, I start with the fact that we have Article 15 of the ICERT, which relates to decolonization. It condemns colonialism and calls on those states that still have colonies to work with them towards independence. I think this article has given us such an opportunity to engage with people who are living in a state of colonization. And whatever the countries want to call them, the colonizing countries, they are colonies. They call them overseas departments, they call them all kinds of things, euphemisms for colonies. And it is an opportunity, and I have been the focal point in terms of Article 15. And it has given the committee the opportunity to engage with those people who are living under colonialism. And I think that's, we have been successful in really holding dialogue with those affected and learning from their experiences. And I think that helps our work. So I would say our responsibility under Article 15, and I think we have had some successes. Then I think I want to look at COVID-19. Of course, it was very bad, still bad. We seized the opportunity as CERD to issue statements. It gave us the opportunity to remind states parties that there is a relationship between the marginalization, the inequities, and the way in which COVID-19 pandemic affected certain marginalized groups. And the relationship of the legacies of colonialism with exactly what happened. Because many of the people in the global south who are living with the harm of colonialism realized that they were affected differently from other populations. And I think it gave us a chance to re-engage states about their responsibility and to issue our statements and bring to the fore the issue of marginalization and structural discrimination in some of the countries where people were most affected, people of African descent, and indigenous peoples especially. And I think the third thing I would say is the ways in which we have been able to adopt general recommendations. We have 36 now, and we're into the dialogue for number 37 on the right to health, again, because of the experiences of COVID-19. I think these general recommendations, especially those which relate to people of African descent, and the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which is wrapped up in that. I think, again, they have given CERD a greater relevance in terms of those who may say, and your question, your guiding question, how can the UN end racism? These three, I think, have given us the opportunity to, publicize our relevance. And really, we have to celebrate the fact that 182 state parties are signatories to the ICERD. I mean, that is not to be taken for granted. And yesterday at the third committee, there were several countries who called on other countries to do the right thing and sign on. And so these three that I have highlighted, I think have enabled me to look at your general question and to say that even though these are successes, and I see you moving to the left, even though you may say that these are successes, in terms of your larger question, can we end racism? Not by ourselves, not by itself. We have to ensure that our statements, our interaction, and our reliance on civil society to be our ears and our voices will work for the benefit of marginalized people.
So let me go to Dominic. The working group of experts on people of African descent is one of, I think, one of the highlight products, if you will, out of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and creation. The working group does fact-finding on the ground. We've visited a number of countries, mainly in the global north. But so tell me what you see as the trends in manifestations of racism over the last, say, 5 to 6 years. What's been happening? And is it getting more virulent? What have you seen, Nathan?
I think it's a great question. I also want to add my thanks to you, Gay, for convening this forum. I've been on the working group for 4 years, and I've been walking the streets of this world for 48 years, and I've really never sat on a stage like this before. So the opportunity to even be in this conversation is really due to you and how you show up in the world. But I think it's a great question. You know, I think for a long time, we used to say things when I was a kid, you know, racism is the product of ignorance. And then we start to understand that racism is perpetuated by people mobilizing ignorance, by mobilizing this idea of innocence and ignorance that there is a racialized product to racist behavior. So on the working group, I'll just promote my mechanism a little bit. I think unlike all the other mechanisms on this panel, we're able to focus on anti-Black racism specifically and the ways in which it was an initial mechanism of global cooperation, how the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans has defined our global economy, has defined our modern global world, and the networks that are enduring even today. And we're able to see this in country to country. When I go, we do travel in the global north, but also in the south. And it should be inconceivable that Black people in the South have similar experiences of racism, of obstacles to basic rights like education and health as Black folk in the global North do. And yet we hear very similar stories from both developed and less developed countries. And, you know, in that space, we also have to confront the idea that for a long time, and for good reason, and even in this country, we spent a lot of time talking about racism in terms of very extreme acts of violence. And we came to understand that this is actually limiting a conversation to the outcome rather than the enabling environment and the buildup of what we were experiencing in the day-to-day as Black folk. And I think for our working group, we're able to really powerfully experience that country to country and hopefully document that. And so maybe I can give you a couple examples. So we were recently in Switzerland and we heard stories of really shocking obstetric violence. You know, Black women have common experiences of fibroids and this can complicate pregnancies. This is very well documented, that experiences of Black women, and women in Switzerland were reporting to us the complete disregard of their pain, that they were being labeled as people with Mediterranean mania, that they were filled with trauma for the pain complaints made to their actual reproductive or the gynecological and obstetric specialists, and late term miscarriages as a result of this. And at the same time, right, if you juxtapose that with a game we heard about in Switzerland called Who's Afraid of the Black Man? Apparently this is a game that's played in schools led by teachers. And student after student came to us and said, this game is racist. You're literally supposed to, it's like a game of tag where you're chasing, and you get caught, you catch Blackness. And so this game is played in Swiss schools today, apparently. And it turns out there's actually been a fairly vocal group of parents and students fighting it, and has not had much impact. The state itself came back in our report and said, well, but this game isn't about race at all. It's about medieval times. It's about the Black Plague. And in fact, it's not a racialized product, and it's not fair or appropriate for you to talk about this as a mechanism in which we are offering young children, ages 3, 4, 5, an opportunity to understand that Blackness is bad, that race has costs and consequences, right? So that's right. This game hopefully isn't actively committing physical violence on anybody, and yet it's structuring mindsets at a point that's far too young to even appreciate what the Black Plague is. And so that's Switzerland, but in state after state, right, we can find these cultural markers, often that are directed toward children, and then the violence that sort of they produce later on. So when you ask if it's more violent, do I have another minute or not?
Yeah.
25 seconds. 20 seconds. So if you ask if it's more virulent, I think I would say it's more normal. That the very trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans that created this sort of escalating profit, that created the markets, the financial market and speculative markets were built on our bodies. That idea continues to animate systemic racism today. In New York City, right, there's a massive defunding of education, as though the schools have ever adequately served Black students, but they're saying, oh, there's fewer schools. We see a tremendous amount of normalizing of systemic racism in the language of the economy, and that's not new.
Thanks. We'll come back to some of that. Tendai, you are ending 5 years of work as a special rapporteur on racism, ending, unfortunately. During which time you have done fact-finding in countries like the UK. But in my view, the most impactful of your work has been the Thing Matters reports. So I want you to talk about, well, as you leave this stage for another, can you sum up what your what the overarching message has been of your time in the minute? What have you been trying to say to the UN human rights mechanisms and to the countries there in the Human Rights Council and beyond? I heard you say this Friday night, so that's why I'm asking. It's your Twitter lead, or as we used to say, your elevator speech.
Okay, so I also have to start by thanking you, Gay, for basically making my wildest dreams come true by being on this panel.
And I also have to say the only thing that I don't like about it is that I can't just listen to everyone. I actually have to pause and say some things. So I think I want to say something about the question that you had sent me in advance, which is about reparations, and then maybe.
I'm coming to that.
Oh, you are? Oh,
Yes.
okay. Okay. So then I
Don't go too far now.
okay. So I guess, you know, when I think about what I've been trying to do with my mandate, it's about bringing to the race and human rights conversation within the UN system, the sensibilities that to me make the most sense for confronting racial justice and racial inequality. And speaking after Dominique, I think is very helpful because as somebody who went to law school because I wanted to be a human rights lawyer, somebody who comes from Southern Africa, which is a region that is characterized and structured by colonial project, including settler colonialism, I've always thought of the human rights frame as a place that I might go to undo the injustices that I really care about. But both in practice and even in my life as a legal academic, and then unfortunately also within the UN system, the dominant approach to thinking about the problem of racism, of xenophobia, of intolerance has been this: there is a bad actor, and the problem is finding that bad actor and putting them in prison, right? Completely eliding the fundamental rules of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, broadly understood to include, you know, indigenous extermination, broadly understood to include, you know, the subordination of people in Asia and Africa, different parts of the world. All of that has to be central to how we make sense of the problems of racial injustice. So bringing this to bear on my time and the mandate, I've been invested in 4 things. First being an account of contemporary racism that keeps an eye on historical injustices and the fact that the past is not the past. The past is very much in the present. And the report that I just presented to the General Assembly, which I'm going to just flag here, is on climate justice as racial justice, which I think really brings home this point that the past is really the present, is really a big part of that. And I think the value of an instrument like the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which to my mind has been completely marginalized within the UN framework and then also within the human rights movement, really speaks to this kind of historicized understanding of the problem of racial injustice. The other piece of it is thinking about a structural and systemic approach to combating racial injustice. Again, I think Durban was really a flashpoint for this. And I think of the 2020 racial justice uprisings as being an echoing of what was achieved at Durban and a kind of taking us back to a really powerful transnational mobilization against racism that says that a systemic analysis is critical, and even a historicized analysis is really critical. Another thing has been thinking about an intersectional approach, right? And it's an intersectional approach that isn't just add women and mix, which is what often intersectionality is reduced to in UN context, but an intersectionality that really thinks seriously about systems of subordination, that thinks about race as a structure of hierarchy, that thinks about capitalism and thinks about class and all of these things as implicated, that thinks about gender identity and gender expression, that thinks about sexual orientation, disability status, all of these structures that really keep us trapped in these kind of silos of subordination has just been absolutely urgent. And this has been important because there are contexts in which I think racial justice advocacy is pitted as counter to an intersectional approach, which I think is a very poor understanding of what the project is. And I think there's also contexts where intersectionality is used to take race off the table, which is also, I think, a really poor approach to this. So that has been something that I've really focused on. And then the final thing is something that, you know, many parts of the world and many different movements have emphasized, but, you know, coming from a school where we do a lot of critical race theory, I think of the work of Marie Matsuda, who's always highlighted the importance of looking to the bottom, what she calls to looking to the bottom, which is about really understanding that those who are on the front lines of oppression, of systemic abuse, whether it's racism, whatever it might be, are actually where we need to go, not just to kind of get testimonials that like, well, tell us what the violations are, but to actually understand the human rights project. And so if we're trying to understand what the project of racial justice is within the UN or wherever, we cannot do that but for connecting very powerfully
with the groups, the individuals who are experiencing racial subordination. And this is what was most powerful, I think, about the racial justice uprisings, which I keep coming back to, is there was a very powerful critique of systemic racism that was bottom up. It was coming from lived experience. It was coming from decades, centuries of having the liberal project be one that means that as a non-white person, essentially, you remain a second-class citizen in many different contexts, right? Whether we're talking about the United States, whether we're talking about Palestinians, whether we're talking about all of these different groups, really kind of insisting, and this is what I've tried to do in my work, may not have succeeded, is that production of knowledge around human rights has to be led by those who are subordinated. And if we're not doing that, we're really missing the boat. So those are my, those are the ambitions that I had for the time and the mandate, those are the ambitions that I had in my thematic reports and my country visits. And whether or not I was successful, who knows? But I just feel privileged to have even had a chance to try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any here, by the way? Okay, because otherwise I'm going to tell guys, please turn up the mics. Justin. How you doing?
Yeah, how you doing?
You can't speak in the mic. I was wrong.
Okay.
People of African descent, a unique body that Stretch is not officially launched yet. We're going to launch officially in December. But here's the thing: the mandate is not fully fleshed out, in my view. Even the resolution talks in vague terms about the body being an advisory body to principally other UN bodies. So what do you think, what are your hopes in terms of what the permanent forum could achieve? And there's a question out and about whether it will be a forum on people of African descent or a forum of people of African descent. So speak to that.
Thank you. Well, we'll also have to join in thanking you for convening us. I mainly came here to take notes. So you'll see me writing notes throughout this discussion, but certainly the latter, Gay, the idea here, similar to what Tendai mentioned from the perspective of critical race theorist Mari Matsuda, who's one of my professors when I was a student, is to quote unquote look to the bottom for a articulation of what human rights may mean for people of African descent. Likely, it may not even mean rights per se, but you may be thinking more so around the need for decolonization, certainly for people on the continent or in the diaspora who are recovering from decolonization. Some other people may use the term Black liberation, which is the term I use. So that's very different from the framework which traditionally has been the driving framework in these discussions around responding to anti-Blackness. Very rarely at the UN have these voices that we're hoping to bring to the table, voices that go beyond the traditional civil society voices. Many of you are a part of that. I'm happy that you're here, but we want to have a mass level of engagement with the permanent forum. So you asked me what my greatest hopes are. My greatest hopes include bringing people who are not the usual suspects per se to the table. We've got Howard University students I have to give a shout out to who are perhaps watching online. They're supposed to be, so I hope they are. So they are going to be going to their hometowns. All the students in my class in 13 different cities, doing a roundtable discussion with at least 10 to 15 different organizations and the city government, and it could be churches and it could be organizations, nonprofit organizations, measuring the sustainable development goals as they relate to the Black populations in that town, Jackson, Mississippi, New York, Chicago, LA, Houston, Texas. So getting non-traditional groups to the table is one of my greatest hopes. You know, in terms of the mandate itself, you know, there are 9 points listed in our mandate. Those points include everything from creating our Declaration of Rights for people of African descent, something that would be similar to the declaration that has been created for Indigenous people, a product of the Indigenous Peoples Forum. So we're trying to follow their footsteps in a sense. Over 150 countries signed that declaration. To monitor the progress of the decade for people of African descent. I'm not sure, this crowd probably knows that we're in the middle of a decade for people of African descent. Not many people know that perhaps outside of this room, and that's one of the problems, right? So pushing forward that discussion you described of providing best practices, advice for other UN mechanisms, asking them to provide reports to us, and asking them, very importantly, to create data, disaggregated data, similar to the data that my students are providing on issues that are affecting our people throughout the diaspora. So that's my greatest hope, you know. And you know, as the question said, can the United Nations end racism? They can't do that if there's racism in the United Nations.
Yes.
And so that gets us to
Yeah.
one of the core questions to ask.
Gets me to the next question, which is for Gaynell, because you offer something in addition to what is offered by your colleagues on stage and your colleagues in the Permanent Forum. And that is that you have actually worked in the Secretariat of the UN for years and in many countries around the world. So you know it thoroughly. And you know, the one thing about the UN that not everybody realizes is that the Secretariat is often a separate center of power and influence that it exerts on all of us and what we can produce. And I got, you know, some of my best friends are in the Secretariat. But you know, during the days of street protests around the murder of George Floyd all over the world, one of the things that happened that was really remarkable was that the Black Undersecretaries General of the UN got together, wrote a collective open letter to the Secretary General, saying, in essence, hey, we got racism here in this institute. So what you gonna do about that? And so my question to you is, what did he do about that? And if the UN has significant problems of racism internally, how does that impact on the work we all are trying to do external, outside?
Thank you very much. First of all, for being here. I'm so honored and privileged to be among such esteemed colleagues. I have been with the UN for a while, 24 years of my life. And that was an interesting period. I went into the UN as a very young officer, as a part of a competitive exam that they offered. And for the first time, 7 Bahamians, I'm from the Bahamas, was allowed into the organization. So I was very privileged to be a part of that. But what hit me right away is that people of African descent, Black people, Africans as well, seemed very burdened and not particularly happy and not really engaged. And I kept asking, what is it? Why? You know, this is such a great opportunity to be here. But I soon learned that a lot of my idealism about the organization was really just that naivety of my youth. You know, the reality is the space there is very much a product of its time, coming out of World War II. It's very much Western. I was the one of 70, I think, persons in my branch, the only person of African descent when I arrived as a junior officer in the system. So that shock coming from a Black nation was quite, you know, shocking for me, to be honest, and to not have the kind of support that I was so used to having, and not needing to prove anything other than my knowledge and my eagerness to learn and so forth. But it was a different environment. And I will say, you know, at the time of George Floyd's murder, and we wanted to step out as an organization, as members in the organization, to say something, we were initially told no. After a bit of pushback, we were told we could. But I was very pleased to see the letter from the seniors. But what struck me is, why so late? Why so long? Why so silent? You know, for so many years, these people are not new to the UN. Did it take George Floyd's murder for them to know that there was racism in the organization, for them to speak out about it? Why were they so silent? Did they not know? Did they not feel it? Did they not witness it, experience it? So yeah, they spoke out, and I think it was well said, and in my view, perhaps better late than never, but it was long overdue, and very disappointing for me that it took a global movement to get my senior managers to speak up for me and for others looking like me from, as I was told, people from your part of the world, right? and to really, when they talk in that letter, and 22 senior managers spoke about, you know, leading by example. And I was like, what example did you show over the years when you received year after year recommendations that only had Europeans? When you received, sorry, you know, when you received, when you had opportunities as senior managers to respond. So yes, I would say fantastic that they wrote this letter. This was encouraging. They finally got the gumption to say something. Hooray. Lots of things happened thereafter. There was a task force set up by the Secretary General who spoke out against it. There was a strategic plan against it. There have been task teams and coordinating teams, and Undersecretary General to be appointed, and P5s to be appointed to as diversity and as diversity needs and so forth. So a lot's happening. Lots of busy stuff started happening, right? We've yet to see, at least from what I can tell, my own experience and those of my colleagues, we've yet to see the results of those. One of the things that came out as a result of that whole experience was the survey that went out among staff. And it showed that those persons, more than 50% of the staff, were feeling that they had experienced or witnessed racism, right? And so it was so clear in the organization. And I have to say that it's a good thing that we got this ball rolling. There was a momentum. Some of us went to see the leaders, and some of us were penalized over the years for speaking out about injustices. I think what could really change in the organizations when we have real accountability, when there is, when senior managers do take the time to get to know their officers, to hear their voices, and to not only take hook, line, and sinker the recommendations coming from their line managers, when they actually are serious about doing temporary special measures to bring people of African descent and others in the room. The reason why we will have so many challenges in trying to get these mechanisms to go is we have a difficult time to even find a person of African descent to support these mechanisms. And my colleagues are doing excellent work. I'm not hitting them in the least, but I'm talking about finding some people with a voice who actually represent. Representation means something. It ought to mean something in the organization.
Thank you. One of the things that we do have to discuss at some point, maybe not now, is why the bodies like CERT or the Permanent Forum don't look at, in some organized official way, racism within the UN. But now I want to open up to a more general discussion. And so I'm going to pitch out some questions for, again, short answers, no speeches, okay? And Yvonne, when you want to chime in, just, wave your hand or something. So here's the first. Thinking of the UN's anti-racism work as a whole, what have been the missed opportunities to prevent or eradicate racism? And why were they missed? What are the critical issues we have been unable to impact and why?
I mean to start just because I'm afraid of everyone else will say the things that I'm thinking, so I'm just going to jump in. And I'm going to actually start by maybe answering a different questions, and I don't even need to go first. I'm going to answer a different one. This missed opportunities framing. What has been remarkable to me is to watch within the UN what from the outside looks like a missed opportunity, but it's actually a calculated set of shifts and reorganizations, bureaucratic, geopolitical, and others, to ensure that what was potentially a truly radical opportunity for justice and change is just metabolized into then what on the outside looks like a missed opportunity. So I think they are produced, they are choreographed, and it's not going anywhere. And I think that's the battle, is keeping our eyes on how those moments happen. And I think we're actually witnessing it now with the outcome of the racial justice uprisings. I mean, I think every day about 2020, and I think about that period between May and say, September. And I'm sure there's people in this room, I'm looking around the room, I know many of you also can think about that. And I never imagined that there could be such a dramatic global mobilization. And I also never imagined that 2 years later, the configuration that came out of that could look the way that it does. And I'm not saying there haven't been important gains made, but nothing that has been achieved comes close to honoring the mobilization and also just the lives that were lost in that period. I mean, those are just the facts, And when we talk about that moment, you were talking about the UN and its response and racism within the response. I remember sheltering in place in May while the protests were taking place and getting messages from people at the UN talking about how they were being told, you shouldn't be protesting, you should remain neutral, okay? And that to me just speaks to what we're up against. The idea that in the face of the largest transnational mobilization against systemic racism, the UN's message to its employees can be, you need to stay neutral, suggests that neutrality has baked into it a very deep comfort with racial subordination. Like that's just 1 + 1 = 2. Like that's just it. So we are now, I think, in a moment where in 2022, we should be mapping what the UN institutional response and the geopolitical response to the racial justice uprising has been. And I've written about this. I actually feel like the momentum has been metabolized by a reversion to sort of the task force approach to racism. We'll create these bodies, these things that on their face seem fine and good, but are exactly how we move far away from really addressing the problem. So anyway, just to say that what look like missed opportunities are very carefully choreographed, and they actually involve relying on what we are taught in law school are the appropriate responses to injustice. I'll leave it there.
Marie?
I think what struck me when I joined the UN system was the which, as a Black woman coming from the Caribbean, there was a one-size-fits-all policy towards our needs and concerns.
Yeah.
And I would say to people who want to know what is the CERD and what does it really do, that imagine, even from when I was in the working group, I remember recalling, this is important, Gail, even a matter of badges. We didn't talk about, so how long you got and how long you got. We just assumed everybody was treated equally, only to find out that those of us from one part of the world got fewer years on our badges than other people. So I'm saying, what is this badge imperialism? And then I think about the way in which we are working genuinely to fight racism and discrimination at the United Nations. But think about what the obstacles that we have to go through as Black people to actually get to the meeting. You know, the indignities we have to suffer. So I have to draft General Recommendation 36 on racial profiling. It I face it at every step of the way when I'm going to Geneva. And in Geneva. And in Geneva. Yes. In supermarkets, I was told to open my bag. You know, I don't know what they think I should be stealing from people. Seeing that there is a problem where the one side doesn't apply because of racism. I also recall during the COVID-19, after the murder of George Floyd, when statues were falling, people were calling for renaming of streets and buildings. And I took on the issue of palliative, that the committee is meeting in a place that has a name that ought not to be there. Yeah. And the fight that we went through to even have a letter sent to the High Commissioner to say, talk to the city about this. I don't feel comfortable staying in here. So I'm saying that the mandate holders themselves face discrimination. And I think we have to be strong in terms of still holding on to that principle that there are others, we have to work for others as well. We have to continue because we can't afford to feel defeated, but we have to bring our concerns to the fore.
Let me ask you, let me throw out another question. In this wake of George Floyd murder, there have been efforts to try to bring into, really? Give me a time check. Into the UN discourse, a discussion of systemic and structural racism. And it's interesting to see that, you know, it's getting on a little bit. The High Commissioner has issued, you know, a very interesting report about structural racism. The Human Rights Council advisory body is doing a study of it. But my question is, you know, is we all on the same page about what these terms mean and what the drivers are for structural racism in this era, not just in a historic era, but now. And is there a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we say structural, you know, systemic, structural, institutional racism, et cetera? Yeah, okay.
You know, I would say it's really funny because you want to say yes, because you can Google some language, but the answer is really no. And I think we've heard some powerful examples here. I'll add some of my own about member states and the UN. We have this, you know, some of us know what systemic racism is because we're kind of confronting it, even in the glances that we get. But it seems to be very difficult for people to acknowledge their complicity in that. And so we've been talking about the Secretariat. Maybe I'll add an example in 2020. Like for a lot of us, 2020 was a powerful moment of opening, you know, of eye-opening sort of impactful episodes. And so we wrote a report on COVID-19 and police violence and the through line of race. And we talked about the history of people of African descent coming to the UN, starting with, well, not starting with, but including Malcolm X, who had come and asked for the African group to come and offer some support to an urgent debate. And of course, then there was an urgent debate. And in my report, the editors, or even though your line staffer might be very supportive, the editors changed Malcolm X's name to Malcolm Little. And that wasn't a small fight to change that back. It wasn't a small process. And finally, I used some language from the trans world of you're dead naming somebody and managed to change it back. They didn't want to capitalize Black. We had member states talking about Black Lives Matter and citing our recommendations. And then 6 months, a year later, saying that we were out of our minds for suggesting that could be racism. So that space about what is systemic racism seems really informed by trend and not necessarily by the experiences of people of African descent or the experiences of systems interacting with people of African descent.
Let's go to a big one. You have to come in. You're on, yeah,
You're
yeah.
breaking. You're breaking, Gay.
Oh, we can hear you.
So you're saying I'm breaking up?
Yes, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Did you want to comment on this question about structural?
My hand was up at the time when we were talking about missed opportunities at the UN. Yes, I wanted to make a little contribution there. As somebody said, you're quite right. The UN is a powerful bureaucracy, whether you like it or not. I was chairing the Internal Justice Council at the UN for 4 years. What our mandate was to resolve disputes between staff and management. And I know that there was a powerful tendency of fear to speak up. And there's an assumption that everybody is treated well, and you have to believe that everybody is treated equally. But those people who would experience, who in their daily experiences felt the unfairness and lived the unfairness of issues at the UN, would be completely fearful of speaking up. Fearful for self-preservation, perhaps. The general response was fear for losing your job because management can retaliate. And indeed, there would be retaliation. And those who were sufficiently courageous to break the silence and report would suffer retaliation. So it was important, therefore, in my view, not to miss the opportunities, both at an individual level and at a collective level. I still believe that the need to stand up collectively is very important at the United Nations. It is difficult to fend for yourself alone, but you'll be surprised how powerful it can be, responses can be, if people do it collectively. And I think people have to share their experiences, they have to share their suffering in order to understand that it is common, it is not about you only. And if people act together, it can be very powerful. And they should do it more.
Thank you. I have been given time check toward the end. Time is flying here. And I started out with 20 questions. But I want to then quickly put 2 questions on the floor. And they are different questions. One is about reparations. One of your today's thematic reports was on reparations and the making all of the justifications under international law for reparations for colonialism and transatlantic slave trade. It was made a big impact in academic and movement circles. But I'm wondering what responses you got from UN states and institutions. And I'm also wondering whether you feel that the UN can be a useful tool or vehicle in advancing the argument for reparations. And let me just go to the next, since time is flying. So some can take the reparations point, some can take this one. While there have been a lot of advances lately in the UN and anti-racism work, and we started out talking about the new institutions, et cetera. And we haven't mentioned, but I think I should, the High Commissioner's report, who's no longer there, on ending with her 4-point transformative agenda on racial justice, a very unusual document from a UN High Commissioner. But so we made some progress, you know, we changed the discourse to some extent, but are we beginning to experience a pushback, a backlash from certain forces within the UN opposing the gains made in recent years? Do you see that? Do you feel that? If so, you know, what do you think that's about? Where is it coming from? And in general, what do you think the limits of the UN's tilt toward justice are? What's so reparations and pushback? Yeah, justice.
Yeah. Well, that reparations question, you know, when I started this work at the UN, you know, my naivete, I didn't realize the extent to which many states see the UN as another platform for them to sort of ding each other. If you're, you know, if you're in China, you know, if you're Russia, you know, you're dinging the US, and that's really what it's all about. And it's not really about human rights. And so countries are happy to ding each other when it comes to questions of racism. We can point fingers, but on reparations, no one really wants to point a finger because they might actually have to start pointing it back to themselves. And so it's an interesting space. I know that I feel confident that the articulations and the analyses like Tendai's report help, especially when you're thinking about universities who are contending with reparations initiatives, churches. We've seen churches have movement on reparations. We've seen local city governments, the city of Evanston, there are many other actors in society that look to the United Nations for guidance. And some of the documents and ideas that we produce are helpful there. The big ball game is the states, the nations. And I'm interested in seeing how that plays out, because I don't think this is a platform where the traditional rules may apply. And so I'd love to hear what Tendai's thoughts are on that. But I think that right now, there's sort of an impasse where nobody wants to sort of be the first to push another state to give reparations. But until then, I think there's a lot that we're doing as we disseminate ideas on repair, provide legitimacy to reparations project. We know that, you know, a couple of years ago, the reparationists were seen as the crazies, or the ones who were
on the margins.
On the margins. When we're talking about in Cobra, we're talking about some of our elders who you know, we've admired for years, but they're even in the, I can say the African-American community.
Are you talking about me?
Yeah, people talking about people I love, right? People who groomed me, you know, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, people who groomed me, you know, they were seen as the margins, even within the Black social justice activist community. And so we're now being thrust into a moment where there's a new arrangement taking place, and I'm very excited about what's going to happen with it. So that's one place where I think there's a lot of hope, at least for me right now.
So today, what was the response to your, not in academic or movement circles, because they're great, but I mean, in the UN and the member states?
So in keeping with being ungovernable, I'm going to say something about the challenges thing and then quickly come back to reparations and say one of the biggest threats I see to racial justice within the UN system is an attempt by UN member states to silo different racial groups in terms of our coordination to push back. And I think this is something we really need to pay attention to. And being in the anti-racism mandate, I've had the privilege of being able to think about racial justice from multiple different perspectives. So I'll just put that on the table. But in terms of reparations, so I was motivated to write that report because of two things. There's a kind of reparations caricature that I think had currency within UN circles, which is that, oh, it's Black people asking for money, right? So there's something that's like, they're actually getting in the way of us solving the problem. And some of you may follow Human Rights Council dynamics. There was a rhetoric to reality resolution that was adopted by the Human Rights Council recently, September, that's actually very powerful and is about trying to take concrete steps to achieve things like reparations. And in the UK's statement in its vote against that a resolution, it basically said, and I could quote, but because of time, I'll just summarize. They'll say, look, that's just distracting. What we actually need to do is focus on memory. Like if we're thinking about historic injustice, especially for slavery and colonialism, let's focus on memory and deal with modern day racism. I don't know what modern day racism is, and I think that also has to be unpacked.
Well, memory sounds like critical rights theory. They didn't mean that.
I mean, see, we need more time, Gay. This is an injustice. We need more time. But so the one caricature is this, that reparations is just about Black people asking for money. And then the other piece of it is reparations are impossible. And that's so pernicious because there's a long record of reparations related even to slavery and colonialism, but it's always just gone to enslavers or people who benefited from colonialism, right? So the same, exactly. And you go,
And the UK, exactly, until very recently. This is
what I love about this. Right, so the myth that it's never happened and the myth that it's just Black people asking for money were both things I was really invested in pushing back against. Highly recommending the report and trying to say that the project of reparations is not just about historic injustice, it's about the contemporary moment. It's about land back to Indigenous peoples. It's about the slave trade. It's about all of these things. They connect. The response from UN member states has been fascinating, and I think the response when the report came out in 2019, how it was dealt with in 2020, and then now in 2022, it has shifted. One thing that is definitely the case is that I think it's harder for them to dismiss the project out of hand, and that feels like a success. And I think it's a result of people in this room and the daily mobilization that just makes it so hard to belittle the project of reparations. And I think that's really important. I do think that the former colonial powers, who remain very influential within the UN, are doing everything that they can, and also current colonial powers, right? Talk about former like there's no current. There's also the former and the current colonial powers are doing everything they can, I think, to shut this conversation down that is proving difficult. And I actually think the climate context might actually be where we see powerful movement, right? Because climate justice is about reparations and it's about racial justice. And because we are in a climate apocalypse for humans, at least, I think that for racial justice advocates, we really should be thinking seriously about not ceding the climate space as a critical one for the broader project of reparations.
Come to the year applause. As someone from the Caribbean, who is deeply involved in the reparation movement, I have to say welcome to the club to those who are on board now, because in the spirit of Rastafari, right, they have been fighting this for decades. So welcome to the club, those who are on board now. And of course, the CARICOM Reparation Commission that was established in 2013 has been really out there plodding along and trying to say a development plan is what we need. At the time of emancipation, planters were given reparation. At the time of independence, they left us and said, go develop, with nothing on which to build our development. So I'm saying that since 2007, actually, we have, and then when we were batting for the decade, as Christina knows, we wanted the theme of the decade to have in reparation, but there was opposition to the that R word. So recognition was okay as an R word, but not reparation. But within the program of activities that we drafted, you will see that reparation is there. But recently, when the president of the Human Rights Council held a dialogue on colonialism and decolonization, somebody from the floor called for the UN to do something more. Not just to have reports, put them on the table, but to have a commission, actually, to deal with the question of reparation. And that's a big thing, I believe, that we can support. But the final point I want to make about the scale, but we talk about countries that are pushing back at this, Tendai, and you know this very well. But the very countries who are saying, we don't owe anything because it was legal at the time, they're busy sending back bedding bronzes and other cultural heritage. Why? Why are you sending them back? If your looting was legal at the time, why are you sending them back now? So why can't you have the same argument towards repatriatory justice? You know?
Well, they're trying to avoid that. They're doing a little bit.
But it's contradictory,
Right.
because you can't say we're sending back something that we stole
Right.
in the 18th, 19th century,
Right.
but we're not talking reparation.
Right.
You know? And it was legal at the time. So keep them then if it was legal at the time. But you can't have it both ways.
So I just want to ask Dominique to talk a minute about this pushback question, because we are dealing, you know, whether you want to talk about where the forces are that are leading the pushback or not, but give me some examples of the pushback.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's profound. I think it's powerful. And I think we have to talk about it. And we have to talk about it in the individual spaces and in the collective space. So I think, so for example, I've been on the working group for 4 years, right? I did a country visit to Belgium my first year. We were very critical because literally every Black parent we met said their children had been diverted from university-bound education, including people with PhDs from Africa couldn't get their kid into a college-bound high school. And so we documented this. And then a couple of years later, Belgium is on the floor of the council saying Black Lives Matter, and we're looking at the working group's recommendation. And then the next year, I go to the council and I say, let's talk about how to build a national action plan. Here's what happened in Belgium. Let's start with the fact that you're diverting kids. Here's the sources of data you could look at to track reform, including what are teachers doing? How are these recommendations playing out? And Belgium, after I leave Geneva, seizes this floor and says, well, it's in her imagination. This couldn't possibly be true. And then, you know, fast forward to now, as Tendai is leaving her post, and I applied for it. And it sounds right. It's hard to talk about this without people feeling like, oh, it's women scorned. And we can talk about that too. But right, as a person who's been active in these spaces and written reports and devoted time and spoken, right? Belgium was the head of the consultative group that looked at who would replace Tendai. And not only was I not even interviewed for the position, which is shocking, they actually opened a parallel process after the whole thing had closed and recommended somebody who was invited to apply in secret. And not only does that show necessarily maybe I'm not their favorite person, but interestingly, the second piece of pushback implicit in that was this reversion from anti-racism to minority rights, right? They're trying to shift the dialogue to something that can be solved in the democratic process with a quota or something like this, and to something that can be powerfully talked about in the global South as a problem that exists among those brown people down there, instead of the very true racialized obstacles existing in the North. And so you see multiple areas of pushback that are sort of like, these have this toy called weevils. Weevils, they wobble, but they don't fall down. The system is writing itself to its kind of white supremacist beliefs. But to talk about it, you have to really bring your personal experiences into that room.
So just to make this very clear, for the first time in decades, maybe 3 decades, maybe more, the special rapporteur on racism is not going to be a black, not going to be a person of African descent, not going to be someone who has that lived experience. In fact, it's always been an African up until this point. Now,
But I think they believe that I think they're going to be wrong. I think they're oversimplifying. I think they believe by choosing a Dalit that they'll start talking about that dynamic of global South governments, but they might be relying too heavily on their stereotypes about race.
Yeah. So, you have a point.
No, I wanted to also get, I mean, this is spot on, Dominic, and it happens within the UN system. This is a pushback. This is such a play that is used. Yeah.
Of the permanent forum.
Yes,
The reason why we say, if we will, first, whether it's going to be a permanent forum on people of African descent or of people of African descent, is that of the 10 positions on the forum, the 10 Black people from the various places in the world, people of African descent, and 1 Chinese.
Yeah.
1 Chinese to work for the Chinese government. So,
and that is
I'm getting a real, because I want to open it up to questions.
But I wanted to just say that I think there's a big part of the problem, and Chanda, you mentioned it as well. This whole pushback on whether we should be speaking about racism or whether modern day racism, whether this is the focus. And let's not speak about the past. We've been told that. I've been told that. I hope that the forum doesn't go too much into that stuff about colonialism, reparations, and so forth. I hope people stick to current day. My point is, how can we have a discussion about what's happening now if we neglect to think about what happened in the past? But that's the pushback we're getting coming to us right now. And we should be speaking about the rights of people of African descent, right?
Okay, so now I want to open to
Okay, sorry, we're the worst panelists because we're just jumping in and preventing you from doing what you want to do. But I do wanted to say one thing, which is that my successor has been appointed, and I'm really hopeful for the work that she's going to be able to do in this role. And I think that's what you're saying as well, Dominique. So I'm really excited for the future of the mandate, even though I myself will not be piece of that future.
So, for questions. I have a question from, first of all, from our online audience. It's a question from Dr. Amara Inye, I might be mispronouncing her name, who leads a global coalition of civil society groups formed to support the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. And her question is, and I don't know whether we've already touched on this. One is, what should UN mechanisms do, or the UN as a whole, to better serve the interests of people of African descent?
I mean, I think one thing would be to hire, speak with, coordinate people of African descent. The fact that we're all sitting together for the very first time speaks volumes. It's not as though you need to be Black to fight racism, but to have these conversations without the leadership and a broad spectrum of perspectives of people of African descent means you're leaving expertise on the table, you're leaving leadership on the table, and you're leaving credibility on the table. And you know, what we see is, right, I'll be in Geneva the week of the 19th, and you'll be in Geneva December 3rd, and then, you know, you were just in Geneva, and then you're gonna be in Geneva, okay, you're there for 6 weeks, but we're all there, we overlap for a day or two here or there, and that's a powerful mechanism of fragmenting.
Yeah,
Mhm.
okay,
Yeah.
can we
Fragmenting is key.
go to Yvonne, please?
Mm.
You have your hand up?
You know what? I had my hand up when I wanted to contribute towards the conversation about reparations.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think this is an important conversation that needs to be had. Firstly, among those who are entitled to reparations, we need to define and have a common understanding of what today we understand reparations to be. Tendai is quite correct. There's a tendency to think that the South is extending the begging bowl for money again, and then they talk about reparations. There are so many creative ways today of modern approaches to reparations. And I think it is important for us to expose those and have the courage to discuss and make demands honestly, openly, with a common understanding that it is not about extending the begging bowl. It is what people are entitled to. Many ways of doing it. The slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, has robbed people of so much that today trade in a number of ways can be used to demand that back.
All right, thank you for that. I now want to go to our in-house audience for questions. First of all, Dr. Angelique Walker-Smith, the World Council of Churches president from North America. Yeah. Quick. Nope.
First and foremost, thank you so much, Dr. McDougall, and thank you all of the VIPs from the UN. Thank you so much for being here. The question that I would like to ask is, number one, given everything that you said about the strengths and the weaknesses of working within the UN, what say you about alliances? In other words, where do we need to go to build out more of the strength that is possible to address the issues of racism? Thank you so much.
Well, can I mean, I think you're asking a question that you're actually the answer to. In our mandate, the World Council of Churches has been an unbelievable partner and a set of resources and partnership that we've needed. And I think for us to be taking a step in any direction without an active listening posture toward civil society organizations, especially global civil society organizations, renders us illegitimate. So to me, not only do we need to actually coordinate better, but without the sort of active engagement we're getting, we have no legitimacy at all.
Okay, I actually want to respond to the question as well. That, you know, I would have asked this question if I had that time, but no. Like, you know, I mean, there are other regional bodies that we need to be spending more time in conversation with. Particularly the, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which has a special rapporteur on people of African descent, doing great work. We've got the OAS. We also have the Inter-American Court on Human Rights that has made some really useful decisions. That's a real court. Also in Europe, you know, I mean, there are at least 10 million people of African descent in the EU alone. So that doesn't include UK
anymore.
So, so, you know, and the EU has, you know, interesting directives and you know, bodies that do very good you know, anti-racism work, but we hardly ever are in
But I think we're doing a lot of that. What we have been doing more of recently is really going across the mechanisms and to have joined up approach across all the UN mechanisms and treaty bodies.
Yeah.
And that's one. And also the regional bodies, UNFPA just had a conference in Barbados and one in Cartagena, and that brought together people from Latin America. So we are a UNESCO, of course, is a partner. We are doing, but I want to just mention the importance of civil society. And the country rapporteurs from CERN certainly make an effort to have dialogue with the you know, NHRIs, but also civil society groups, which consists of people of, you know, different orientation and beliefs. And civil society really help us to understand what's going on in the ground, and a kind of not counter, but complementary sometimes opposite to the state party report. So we, I think, can do more, but I think we are reaching there with the regional bodies and all the other mechanisms.
the problem, you know, tends to be, at least with her, time and staffing. The UN is past its limits in terms of staffing that could support the work that we do. It's critical, it's an existential problem we're facing right now.
But Gary, I would add that the staffing is different. Like the resources that CERD has relative to other treaty bodies is not the same. So that we might also think about inequality and distribution of resources among the UN.
And I would want to add also in terms of timing, the amount of time that we will meet, we'll really only have, we have one meeting a year, and our term is 3 years, and we have 4 days. So we meet 12, the permanent forum, people of African descent. And this is it. I mean, 4 days that we will, it's really not enough.
It will force you to work intersessionally.
Yeah, and this is where we have to build those partnerships. And that's where we have to build those partnerships. And we had a really good one with UNFPA, and we're hoping to do similar in other regions as well.
I only have 2 to 3 more minutes, so I want to have another question from the, yes, please.
Hi, yes, I am. My name is Joy Banner, and I'm from Louisiana, from Cancer Alley, and me and my sister on invitation and in partnership with the Center of Constitutional Rights, who are legal advocates down in Louisiana. I guess invited us there to speak on some of the racial issues, especially the environmental racism that we are experiencing in Louisiana. And I guess my question, first of all, the ability for us to be at the UN and have that moment to speak, you know, at the UN was an incredibly powerful moment for us. So I want you all to understand that I know that the UN has a lot of movement and a lot of growth, but being able to take that back to our communities when our local governments won't listen to us, the fact that we were in Geneva testifying in front of the UN made some things move. And so I just appreciate, you know, the amount of time and effort that you give to this, because it does make a difference. My question is, do you think that we should spend more time on disparity rather than getting rid of racial discrimination, which seems impossible? And I say that because in particular, we are dealing with an EPA investigation right now, and Lord knows EPA, speaking about growth, there's a lot of growth that's needed there. But one of the ways that we have been able to get some movement is that, you know, that Title VI, that it is about disparity and there's not the intentionality of discrimination. So do you think that there is some movement or being able to focus on, it doesn't matter whether you intended it to be discriminatory, the facts are the facts, here are the numbers. So do you think that there is kind of some room for the UN to kind of on, nations or states to have policies that look at the disparity and less about, I mean, it would be great to not have racism, but what about the data and the facts?
Well, that is what the discussion about structural racism focuses on. And the Convention Against Racism has a clear provision that is focused on disparity.
Yeah.
In every single way possible in life,
Article
right?
1. Article 1 sets up the grounds
Yeah.
of discrimination, but also there's not necessarily an incompatibility, because by looking at the disparities, you also look at the remedy, which is eliminating racial discrimination.
So one other quick question. Yes, Catherine.
Thank you, Professor Matugo, for convening us, and to my colleagues for such a great evening of insightful information and the depth. My question relates to the oversimplification of money when it comes to it being linked to people of African descent having access to it. This whole push to separate reparations from money is something I think we should insist, because if money is power, money is connected to God. We either have God or money, and I think we are the first group that is being told that we cannot talk about money in relation to reparation. The Jews are still receiving money since 1951. When we talk about the trust fund for victims that the International Criminal Court, we're talking about money. So why should people of African descent not talk about money? I think I will talk about money and beyond.
Yes. But we do talk about money in the CARICOM. You should all look at the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice. If we say the former colonial powers need to address the issue of education and the inequalities and the insufficient number of schools and so on, it means you have to sit down and calculate what money it will require to address the issue. And we are calling for the return of the compensation money in the current equivalent. So money is not, I agree with you, I resist that too. But it's just that the blueprint for repair is done differently because it's a development plan. But it takes cash to care, and so I mean, you can't build schools, build bridges of understanding between Africa and the Caribbean, get back our stuff and ask for museums to host them without money. So it's just a different language, perhaps. But like you, I would resist that as well. Yeah.
One last point, a question. Yes, yeah.
On the point about COVID and the TRIPS waiver and such, I was just wondering what opportunities or perhaps strategies there may be to leverage these institutions at the UN to hold other multilateral institutions accountable for the ways that they maintain and perpetuate structural racial discrimination. That's to say the WTO, World Bank, IMF, etc.
Well, she's not taking this up, but we did pass a statement, a decision on the inequity in the distribution of vaccines, and calling on the WTO, mainly calling on the powerful nations that
Oh, I had actually mentioned that in my opening. So I had made the points about and the pushback we got when we wanted to use the language of vaccine apartheid. We were mashed down by those who Who didn't like the term?
But I think if I may, you know, I should be sitting.
You should be up here, that's right.
But I think if I'm, you know, it is not, that's a territory has not been fully explored.
Yeah.
But it is a critical, important next step. And I think that we all have to figure out how to do it in a way that we can first talk about the ways in which international, you know, multilateral institutions are actually producing, they're the drivers, the present day drivers of these inequalities. So why can't we, in our mandates, find ways to
But
reach
I
out?
think the working group, from the time I was on it, started to hold bilateral talks with these multinational organizations, these financial institutions. I'm sure you have.
Yeah, there's been some.
There's
There's been some. And I think, you know, World Bank came forward and World Bank IMF came forward and talked about trying to act as a balance for some of the balance of power during COVID and stepping in as negotiators for some countries that didn't have the ability to get PPE, the ability to get. And so we've been having these talks in the ways that we do, but you know, it's very haphazard and it's here and there at a time. Catherine, our current chair, is very interested in building out the AU's voice and connection to us, and also building out the AU's work on the diaspora. And so I think these are happening in the ways that they can, given the way these mandates are structured.
Look, you know, we are totally out of time, but I think this has been a fabulous discussion. I hope the audience feels that as well. And we have to definitely do it again.
Yes.
At the top.
Perfect. Okay, better. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this incredibly important conversation to our law school and to our community. I want to say a few thank yous and just add a thought or two of my own. And when I say that, I understand I'm talking in a room full of people who have lived this issue, worked on it for decades and years. The title of the program is Can the UN End Racism? So no, I guess the UN can't end racism, but can indeed be a powerful force, as we have heard, of the great work that's being done and the major obstacles and challenges that it faces. But when we come back to the task of ending racism, you know, I, as the dean of a law school, need to look within as well, because I think that's the only way we actually make true and lasting progress, is if those of us in positions of authority and leadership ask hard questions about our own institutions and about ourselves. And I just wanted to first acknowledge that and to say that we have been engaged in that process here at Fordham Law School, and I see Rafael Zapata from the university is here, and we've engaged in this process at the university as well. And so first we've started looking inward, both at the composition of our students and faculty and the leadership on our staff, the support we provide for students, the sense of belonging and inclusion. We've done a comprehensive study of the racial climate here at Fordham Law School, and things have followed from that. And we have been instituting exciting new programs. I don't want to talk about that so much as the next piece, which is we need to look inward, but we also need to look outward. And the legal profession is one of the least diverse professions in the United States. The statistics are just stunningly bad. And we are in the position of educating the next generation of lawyers. The students who come through our doors make up the legal profession of the future. And so I'm acutely aware of that. And so in terms of looking outward, I'm so excited that we at Fordham are lucky enough to have incredible leadership at our school. And I want to thank you, Professor McDougall, for your incredible leadership here within Fordham and for all that you have brought to our community. Including this conversation, and also to our centers that you heard from directors of the Lightyear Center and the Center on Race, Law, and Justice about the work that they are doing and collaborating together in trying to make a difference on these issues out there in the world. And we have faculty who work on these issues as well. I see my colleague, Professor Catherine Powell. I want to say hello and acknowledge your great work on these issues as well as you, Professor Galizzi. But to really focus on the fact that this year we've launched for the first time the only, to my knowledge, clinical program on global anti-racism. We've heard about how understaffed and under-resourced the UN mechanisms are. And so our goal is to offer the talents, energy, brilliance of our students to this cause, to work through you, Professor McDougall, along with Liz Wickery, Zanande Bui, and Paolo Galizzi, to add our efforts to this cause. And I just want to take a moment to ask the students in the clinic to stand. So I think we've got a bunch of you here, please. So I say to you as your dean, I'm incredibly proud of your work and we're here to support you. And thank you all for being here tonight. I realize I'm standing between all of you and a reception outside. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much.